Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a nice, short, sharp episode for you talking about 4 common misconceptions. We're going to get into pulse stretching, how to train when injured, whether pain is good or bad in various different situations, and tackle a few questions which we get asked about a lot. So hopefully you've got some great takeaways from this episode. But before we get into it, as always, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check it out if you're a coach or movement professional interested in leveling up your movement mechanics knowledge. wit-fitness.com. Please use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hydro, please use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Right, Rob.
Yes.
Common misconceptions.
I know. Well, pole stretching. I love the idea of this. And it's something where I know, especially from after doing your mentorship and stuff, it was already something that was on my radar anyway. But generally holding a static stretch, for me, I like to class it as upgrading the stretch by adding in some pulsing rather than just aimlessly pulsing, like having an idea, excuse me, having an idea of where I'm reaching to, where am I pulsing to, what does that feel like? Am I actually stretching and contracting, so lengthening and shortening the muscle? Like, what is going on? So it's very common, as most people think, that this is bad because it's like they're thinking, right, I'm in a big stretch. Why would I want to move here? I want to let the body relax into it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I actually had to do some Googling to remind myself of why people thought pulse stretching was bad, because it's been so long since I've thought about it in that way. And it reminded me of, I actually remember going rock climbing when I was at school, and the climbing teacher was talking about stretches and how important flexibility is for rock climbing, showing us a few stretches. And he actually said, you're supposed to just hold it like still, but I find it works way better if you do a gentle pulse, even though you're not supposed to. And I was just like, so if it works better when you pulse, then why are we not pulsing? And obviously, probably 20 years later, I now understand why. And as you're talking about there, the reason we pulse our stretches is that we want the muscle to learn to contract from that new length. We don't want to just get the muscle long and leave it long. The whole point of muscles is that they lengthen and shorten. So if we're just teaching them to lengthen and switch off, they're no longer functional. They can't create force. They can't create tension. So any stretch you can think of that lengthens a given target muscle, you can use the same stretch, but just gentle pulses going in and out of the range is going to make it much more effective, both in terms of developing the range of motion, but also making that muscle usable in that range of motion. And I think it's important to distinguish a pulse stretch from a ballistic stretch, which is what people think of, I think, when they think about the dangerous side. We're not saying you need to go in there with loads of speed and loads of load. We're just asking you to tease that end range and just dip in and out of it so that it's a safe environment for the nervous system to accept the new position rather than very suddenly and aggressively entering an uncontrolled range of motion.
So so people using yoga to be more mobile and flexible and stuff like that, I guess, because a lot of that is quite, well, there's different styles of yoga, but then obviously quite a lot of the styles of yoga is prolonged holds.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so on that, then my question then comes to the thing of, I know from experience as well, and I guess you will as well, that people that then come from yoga then obviously struggle to actually use that range that they have. So this is where, like, people that are potentially hypermobile or just have all this range of motion but no strength whatsoever, so they hit that end range and just collapse. So then they actually find it really hard to actually even shorten the range and maintain the strength. So this is then where I guess you'd like to rewrite the book of the yoga world, right?
Slightly, yeah. So we go into this in a bit more depth in our hypermobility episode, but essentially there's a few styles of yoga which do focus on the long static stretches, which are enjoyable, are nice, are good for down regulating your nervous system, but they are not good for athletic performance because you're literally training your muscles to turn off rather than turn on. It's something we go into real depth on at the start of the mentorship because it really underpins a lot of how the body moves. Like, how does a muscle interact with the nervous system? How does it permit range of motion? And essentially, like, without getting into the nitty-gritty of the anatomy of a muscle cell, what you're training, what you're doing to your muscle, it will get good at. So if you're training it to be long and relaxed, it'll get good at being long and relaxed. If you're training it to lengthen then shorten, it'll get good at lengthening then shorten into your specific range of motion. So by pulsing your stretch, you're not sending the signal to say switch off when you get to that long lengthened state. So say sitting in a squat for 20 minutes trying to relax as much as you can, you will feel more comfortable sitting in the bottom of the squat. But what you won't do is develop power out of the hole unless you bounce in that position or you load it up and develop actual strength there. And I think that long static stretch notion feels good and you see improvements in flexibility, but because it's generally done away from your training session, you don't connect the dots to think, hang on a minute, is my strength actually improving in this range, or can I just get there passively, which is fine for like a resting squat if you just want to do the old paleo chair. But if you're looking to actually develop strength in your squats, you'd be much better off doing pulsed variations alongside obviously squatting to depth with your weight.
Yeah, and I think this was obviously quite a prevalent thing a little while back, especially within a CrossFit world, where there was a couple of like programs to follow along, which would then be based more on long static holds and trying to improve your performance in the CrossFit sphere. So the idea behind it was intentionally correct, as in like, cool, we want to increase your range so that you can get better depth wall balls, better overhead position in your overhead squats. But the actual how to do that, the execution of it was then obviously slightly incorrect and could be improved on. So, and I think that's obviously, as you said, doing, they say, a squat, there you go, like as you said, sitting in the bottom of a squat, but then adding in some, you know, some little bounces and stuff, getting in and out of that position. So you might do 20 minutes of accumulated squats, but within that 20 minutes, you're actually coming in and out of the squat and doing all sorts of things in there, and also just moving around from side to side in the hips as well. And then, you know, because that's also important. It's all well and good just being in this static position, but you'll even find it gets boring. So it's also, it's nice to just kind of to explore into the right side, explore into the left side, and just play around in these positions. And this is where obviously, like, when you start to look at kids and stuff, it's because they don't ever stay still. They're always doing shit and they're always moving. It's amazing, just like watching my daughter just get up from the floor and like she'll randomly go and do something. You're like, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you moving that there? And there's no comment, like no sense behind that. But she's always moving. So it's like no wonder they have so much range. It's because they're constantly moving in these positions.
Exactly. It's very much use it or lose it. So if you're constantly exploring all those positions, your body will retain them. You only start to lose range when you stop using a position. So that's why specializing your movement, you can become very good at one specific thing, but it can be at the expense of losing positions in other ways because your body's just learned this is the only position that matters. And one thing else I wanted to pick up, you said earlier about the using yoga for CrossFit, it will have some benefits and there's plenty of people who feel better from it. But the way I think about it is that you're making it a two-step process rather than a one-step process, in that you can develop the passive range of motion, which you then need to stabilize and strengthen after you've developed the range, because you've got all this loose passive range, versus doing your pulse stretch, you're teaching the muscle to contract from its new range at the same time as developing the range. So you're leveling them both up at the same time. It's a one-step process. You just do that and you train it. That is the end goal, is good range of motion with strength. So why don't you just go directly for it rather than getting range of motion first and then developing strength? Beautiful.
So second one, I think, kind of leads on quite nicely from some previous episodes where we've been talking about injury, and we're discussing then how a common misconception is stopping training when injured. And I think on episode 126, I think it was, where we discussed about like the mindset of injury, and when we've had John Houghton on in previous episodes, especially his first episode where we dive into actually the benefits of doing other stuff to make your injury process shorter. Yeah, it's a crazy common misconception, but it's completely understandable, because it's like what's been drilled into us is in like, you know, rest is best. And it's sorry, I just read that note and I didn't even realize I'd taken that in, but it's in like it is funny because that's what we're told, is like you want to rest it. And but the thing is I think as the industry is evolving, it takes so long to get that information out to the general population, because it's like once something that sounds right has been drilled into it, it's then to say, well, actually, we're wrong. Let's try and wind that back a little bit. Like, it just doesn't make sense to people. It's like, no, you told me that I need to rest it. So that's what I'm going to do, because it's less work. Whereas now it's saying, actually, you should probably keep moving. It's like, no, I want rest. I want to do it and have a perfect excuse to stay not training.
Yeah, exactly. It's short and it rhymes, so it must be true. So I think it's symptomatic of a lot of attitudes in fitness and the wider world, in that people want simple rules to live by. They don't want nuance. They don't want exceptions. They don't want to have to think through the issue and challenge what they've heard. And this is how like old wives' tales get perpetuated. So the reason I wanted to talk about this one is that there are many situations where an injury will actually improve faster with continued training. As you alluded to there, Dr. Houghton was talking about improving blood flow, which also increases how quickly tissues can heal. You can obviously train around an injury. I think that's pretty well understood. But essentially, the rare situations where you really need to rest an injury, you probably only need to rest the specific part of the body which is injured. So if there's acute tissue damage, then obviously you want to lay off it to give it a chance to heal. But so many other types of injuries may not require actual healing. Even like a mild muscle tear, you don't really need to take time off it, because the fibers that are torn. So we actually just want to get on with strengthening the other ones. And we'll talk about pain in the next couple of points in a bit more detail. But the worst or the most frustrating thing I see with people who are injured is the types of injuries that actually get worse through resting. So these are people who tend towards being unstable. So if you're in a rhythm of training 5-6 days a week, you then just go to bed rest because you've got a bad back. It will actually slow down your recovery, because part of the reason your back is bad is because you're unstable somewhere. So if you stop walking around, you stop loading your muscles, you lose tone in the muscles, so you lose stability, and the back pain can actually exacerbate because you're losing so much tension. The other classic example is something like an ankle sprain, where somebody will like tape up their ankle and stay in bed for a few days. And because they're not putting any load through the foot, they're not challenging the stability or the mobility of the ankle. It just starts to stiffen up more and more, compared to putting as much weight as you can bear. Like if you need crutches, you need crutches, but you should always be trying to test the movement within tolerable pain to keep the blood flowing, but also keep the joint moving as much as is possible, so that the body remembers this is an important tissue that needs to stay supple rather than just staying super stiff. And yeah, it's a pattern I've seen with a few people who've rolled ankles. The ones who stay in bed always take longer to recover, and when they do recover, the ankle's much stiffer than somebody who gets on it as soon as possible, even if it's just 20% weight bearing with a few knee bends to try and get a tiny bit of movement in. As we spoke about in that injury recovery episode, you can quantify that, you can progressively overload it so that you are still taking active steps towards full motion in that ankle.
Yeah, so for me, I really like the example of the rolled ankle, because that is a really common one, mainly because walking does suddenly become this massive hindrance, and it becomes really challenging. And most people don't have a set of crutches around on their house to say, right, okay, I've rolled my ankle, I can now use those. So it's very easy to say, right, okay, let me get it elevated, you know, give it a bit of rest and stuff. And it can then become quite easy to, as you say, I'm going to just rest up a little bit more because it's, you know, it's needed, and it's a nice easy justification. Whereas then you may not have crutches, but what you could do is sit on the end of a chair doing some, bringing your toe towards your knee and then extending it. Don't necessarily have to put that pressure on it just straight away, but you are trying to move it. And it kind of leads into like the point above with the pulse stretching. And it's like, what we're trying to do is coerce the body into doing what we want within what it's capable of at the moment. And we're trying to allow that signal from our brain to say, when our brain is saying, don't move it, it hurts, to then saying, actually, I can stop being a little bitch and I can move it a little bit, you know. I often, like, when I've got a bit of a shoulder issue or any type of pains, I'm just like, I'm going to move it. So I use blood flow restriction quite a lot for that. So I can use lighter loads, get some blood flow towards the muscles, the joints and stuff that I'm trying to target. So I'm currently suffering with a little bit of an elbow issue. So I've been doing a fair bit of blood flow restriction work before I go into my bench press work. And just the way I know that pain hasn't necessarily fully gone, but I don't feel it anywhere near as much when I'm then benching. And afterwards, it's not then suddenly coming back full force saying, oh, you shouldn't have benched. It's just my body. My elbow pain is a little bit of inflammation and my body's trying to protect me so I don't do it again. So with something like this, is your body's trying to do the safest thing, and sitting around is probably its safest thing for not dying. So that's the worst case scenario your body's trying to protect you from. So what we try and do with training is to essentially rip you up, tear you up, beat you down, so you can get stronger, bigger, fitter, and stronger. It's a really funny thing that we do, but it's you understand why rest is the preferred thing to make yourself feel better.
Yeah, I think you touched on something that's a useful point as well, in that it wasn't worse the next day. So big caveat is that we're not saying that all injuries you should just train through and ignore. Your body will give you feedback if you're trying to push it too hard too soon. And for things like a tendonitis is the classic example, you need to actually load that tendon, but the level of loading when you're stimulating but not aggravating. So if you get a lot of feedback the next day, say it's even more painful than it was the day before, that's feedback that the session you did was probably a little bit too much for where you are currently. And if you've tracked that session, you know exactly what the dose of exercise was that was too much, and you can dial it back for the next one once it's settled down. So the point we were trying to make is that there is a balance to strike, but generally people tend towards over resting a lot of these like stability or sprain injuries, when actually once the acute healing has finished, getting movement into the joint as soon as possible will result in you getting back to training sooner.
Nice. So I think as we alluded to, kind of we want to discuss pain a little bit more, and the next point is no pain, no gain. And for me, it just instantly reminds me of the movie, you know, Pain and Gain. Obviously with the bodybuilders and stuff. So it's obviously The Rock, Mark Wahlberg, and was it Jason Statham or someone like that? I don't know. I think there's someone else in there. I don't know. But anyway, and it's like about pushing your boundaries in a way, obviously within the sphere of bodybuilding stuff. But it's funny because it's like the no sleep for the people that want to progress, or, you know, you have to get up early to be able to be a success, and all these things of everything has to be hard to be the right thing to do. And we can easily pull out extractions of other things where actually it isn't always the case. And like for me, one of the go-to examples in my head is zone 2 work versus high intensity work. Like zone 2 work feels like you're literally doing nothing. And you're like, what is this doing? This is an absolute waste of time. And that is the exact words that go through my head when I was doing it. So, you know, high intensity work, you're like, right, well, I've got a sweat. I've worked hard. My heart rate's elevated. This must be better for me. Yeah, exactly. I think there's a phrase I like around this, which is suffering does not equal success. And I think a lot of people who like working hard don't feel like they've done a session unless
they've really got out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
And that's obviously very helpful, and in a lot of situations, a productive mindset to have. You're able to, push your envelope. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a place for the low intensity, easy work where you leave the gym actually feeling better or not tired at all. That can still be very, very productive, especially if you're already training hard in other sessions. Like for people, people who train more than once a day, you're probably not, depending on the time of the season, you're probably not going to be emptying the tank twice a day. So having the acceptance that you can go into the gym, do some work, and leave feeling like maybe you haven't even trained, but still make progress, I think is a hard mindset shift from those classic sort of bodybuilding, no pain, no gain, which is true in that realm. But when we're looking into a broader range of fitness dimensions, like cardiovascular fitness, there is a massive place for the zone 2. But also, if we go into the strength sports, you can have a pure skill development session.
Yeah.
So doing the movements, practicing your technique, that can be an entire session without having to go heavy, without having to do high volume so that you leave really tired. If you think about pure skill sports, it's really obvious. If you're trying to play golf, you're not going to hit balls until you're exhausted, because probably the last 30% of that session is actually reinforcing bad habits rather than good habits. So why do we think about the snatch completely differently, in that to do a snatch session, we have to have lifted a heavy weight? Like, a lot of people spend a lot of time with an empty barbell for very good reason. That's a really great opportunity to teach the body to refine motor patterns and bar path and all the technical aspects of the lift without it being physically challenging. So I think especially in the CrossFit space, you see this, you have to have a WOD, you have to have a finisher. And I get it, because it's fun and it's satisfying to be exhausted. But I think it's not very productive in a lot of cases.
I mean, like, it kind of sounds like we're just boring old, old fogies. Oh yeah, just do some easy work, guys. Stay away from your high intensity stuff. It's not good for you. And it's like, it's definitely not what we're saying. And I think it's when your whole week is all go, 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 you forget about the other stuff. And as Ash mentioned there, like how, when you're trying to learn a skill, if you're under duress, if you're stressed, trying to learn a skill, your body it's going to be so tight, it's not going to flow, because it's going to be holding all this stress in your body. It's not going to, and when you're trying to learn a skill, you want the state of flow. So you want to be able to think, right, okay, what's my body doing in this position? And so it's just, I think, like what you said there with the snatch, it just reminds me of when I see people, and as soon as they've done the bar, and when I say see people, it's sometimes me in the mirror, and it's like, and I say to people, and I say, like, it's so funny how we're building up to, say, an uncomfortable snatch, so we're building up to, say, a heavy one, whatever, right? And I say to people, you shouldn't move on if you like had a bit of a sketchy rep, say 50 kilos and you're building to 100. You shouldn't move 50 and say, right, 60 kilos on the bar because it will feel better. It's like, no. You want, for me, it's like 2 to 3 successful quality reps at that weight before you're moving on. And then it might come down to just at least one successful one. And if it went well, cool, you can move on up and stuff like that. That's fine. But it's funny because it's very easy to think, because of the lighter stuff, you're like, oh, it's a waste of time. And it's like, because the real work is the 100 kilos that I'm actually trying to lift for one. It's like, no, all the foundations that you just done before that is the stuff that sets you up. And it reminded me of when I was trying to build originally to my 130 snatch, and I got stuck at 120. Well, not even 120. I couldn't hit 120 because I kept doing a whole different technique. I'd do 110 fine, and then I'd tighten up everything, and I'll go, right, I'm going to be better this time for the 120. It would never be right, even though on the whole way up, I'd done this whole other technique. And it's then because I then, at that state, just started to let my mind wander into just like the more intense state, just like, I've got to get it done, rather than just staying in that like flow state of being quality with a bit more higher rest and stuff, and making sure we're thinking about executing things properly. So it's just, skill development can also be heavy work. And that's saying it's learning a skill under heavy load. So that's why I want to just kind of make it clear that when we are talking about these things, it's not just taking the easy route. It is having the balance of both and making sure you're having exposure of extremely high heart rates, and you're also having exposure of steady low heart rates for sustained periods of time.
Yeah, I think that's the balance is essentially people love the hard work and the heavy lifting, and they think that's the only way to make progress. Whereas actually, there's a lot of benefit that's been left on the table by embracing the air quote easier stuff.
Yeah. So, and then that leads us on to avoiding pain at all costs for point number 4. What do you mean by that, mate?
So there's a great quote from Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels that I like. It's a little bit of pain never hurt anybody. It's true. I think that people have it depends. Everyone is an individual, and different people have different tolerances and appetites for pain and types of pain. Typically, elite athletes have a very high pain tolerance and will ignore any sort of pain to get the job done, especially in competition. And that has pros and cons. But at the other end of the spectrum, you get some people who are towards the hypochondriac side of things, where the slightest bit of discomfort will mean they think they shouldn't train, or they shouldn't do a certain movement, that it has to feel just perfect or totally symmetrical. And I think, similar to the point above, there is a balance to strike here, and having an understanding and appreciation of how serious the pain is can actually be very empowering to understand. Yeah, it's normal that at the end of a tough block of training, where say I'm peaking towards competition, little niggles, little aches and pains are coming out. But if they're not chronic and long term and getting worse, then that's actually not the end of the world. Especially like going out running. If you haven't run for a little while, you expect a little bit of discomfort here and there as the rust starts to blow off the joints. So having a measured approach to understand the different types of pain, like DOMS versus, lactic acid buildup versus joint pain. I think just being a bit more curious to think about what's actually going on in my body. Is it actually a problem, or is it just part of the stress adaptation process, which is training? We stress our bodies, we make it uncomfortable, we make it hurt a little bit so that it grows, develops, and comes back fitter and stronger.
Yeah, for me, like when I read this point, like it really resonated with me, because I'm a massive advocate of trying to coach people into having a better connection with their body rather than just performing a lift. Because like most coaches will coach you how to do something, and I'm one of those coaches. Ash is one of those coaches. We can teach you how to do something. Then obviously it then goes, when you're peeling back the layer of an onion, right, going down to the next layer. Of course, you have an understanding of what it should look like, and you know what the movement is. Then you understand, cool, how does the body feel when doing this movement? How does my right side feel to my left side? Or how does it feel afterwards? It's like, these are questions most people just will never get to ask. They say, right, did it look right? Yeah, sweet, move on. And that's it. And that's fine. If that's how you want to treat your training, is just a task that you have to do and get done. This is where I think bodybuilders are really good, obviously with the mind-muscle connection and getting a real good connection with, say, their bicep while they're doing bicep curls and making sure they're stressing the area. Now, when it comes to avoiding pain at all costs, for me, it's like, this is then where you have an internal question. Say, using my elbow as an example, I go into a session and I start out with the intent of benching. And by the time I get to the bench after like 1 or 2 sets, it's just not feeling right. And then I've tried, so I haven't avoided it. So I've tried to make it feel right. It hasn't felt right. So it's not just a state that I'm in from, say, DOMS. It just doesn't feel good. So then I'm either going to do a lower body session or stay away from any pushing and focus more on some pulling. I'm going to adapt my session because I've taken the internal look and saying, what's going on? Is it something bad? Is it something that maybe just needs a little bit more rest? And it could do. And it might just need a little bit of extra rest while I'm stimulating something else in the body, instead of then just hammering it through and having no conscious thought behind what I'm doing.
Yeah, exactly. I think it goes back to our our rest point, in that once you've got an accurate prescription of what's actually going on with the injury, then you can make an informed decision. So is there something you can do for the elbow where you're, like, if it's a tendon injury, which it sounds like it probably is there a low level exercise where you can stimulate it to promote healing rather than smash through your heavy bench session, which is going to aggravate rather than stimulate? But what you've done there is not avoid the movement. You're testing it, you're thinking about it, you're trying to discern, to gather a bit more information about the condition so you can make an informed decision going forwards. And again, big caveats, lots of nuance. We're not saying never avoid pain. Like, sometimes you're getting a big signal from the body that you shouldn't load a certain tissue. But I think that hypersensitive, this doesn't feel quite right, so I'm going nowhere near it for a long period of time until it feels 100%. With something like a tendon injury, it will never feel 100% unless you load it. So at some point, you've got to start progressively overloading it. It will be uncomfortable, but it's part of the stress adaptation process. So if we reference that injury mindset episode again, if you are grading your pain on a daily basis out of 10 and you can track improvement over time, you know it's working. If it's getting worse from certain sessions, you know you're doing too much. And I think having some objective data just gives a lot more security around the method that you're approaching to your recovery. Because if you're having a bad day and you think it hurts loads, but you haven't got anything to compare it against, if you're feeling a bit upset, you're probably going to perceive the situation as worse than it actually is. Whereas if you can see the macro trend of, actually, you know what, this is working, it is getting better over time, it doesn't feel good, but it is slowly improving. So touching the movement, touching that part of the body isn't an absolute no-go.
Touching, so if you would like to know a little bit more deeper, gain a deeper understanding of kind of some of these points, check out episode 45, when does a niggle become an injury? Because a lot of these points that we've kind of discussed today kind of stem from the injury side of things. So it's like we dive a lot deeper into those sort of, like, when we start to talk about tendons, how to approach it and stuff. So check out episode 45, and that will hopefully give you a better insight into maybe understanding what's going on a little bit more. So I think that's it for today. We have got a few other points we should probably go into, but we'll save that for another episode. Anything else, mate?
No, I think that's a good one. Awesome.
Well, we really hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you do have any questions that you'd like us to answer, do drop us a message. Either head over to Instagram, it's probably the best place to get us, at lunge.lift. Send us a message on there. We'll be sure to try and get your question answered in an episode. As always, thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate every one of you that listens every week. Keep sharing, keep doing the good stuff, and any reviews that you want to leave that you can, from any accounts that you can, we'd appreciate every extra review we can. So thank you very much as always. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.